The courthouse was quiet, save for the distant echoes of footsteps along the cold marble floors. Rain drummed relentlessly against the windows, as if nature itself was trying to drown out the noise inside. The small-town courthouse, normally a place where families settled petty disputes, now held the weight of something far darker. Officer Jack Rayner, once a proud and revered figure in the community, stood trial. He was accused of manslaughter, the death of a young girl that still haunted the town. The courtroom was filled with tension, and even the air seemed heavy with the uncertainty of what was to come. "Is this really happening?" A whisper fluttered across the seats. Jack sat motionless at the defendant's table, his face gaunt and eyes hollow. He hadn't slept in days, not since the charges had been brought against him. His mind was a maze of conflicting thoughts, but there was one thing that had never wavered. He was innocent. His partner, his loyal canine companion, Shadow, was the key to unraveling the truth. But as the trial raged on, Jack knew his hands were tied. He could only hope the truth would surface in time, before it was too late. The defense attorney, a weary man with a nervous tic, argued with all the desperation of someone trying to hold a sinking ship together. But the prosecutor, a cold and calculating woman with no empathy in her eyes, held the cards. She painted Jack as a man who'd crossed a line, a man who had let his emotions cloud his judgment. The evidence, though thin, was damning. A witness who had claimed to see Jack in the area the night of the incident. A blood-stained shirt. A few missing hours. But none of it was the truth. Jack could feel the lie gnawing at him, threatening to consume everything he had worked for. He clenched his fists under the table, the quiet tremor in his hands a reminder of how powerless he felt. But then the doors to the courtroom opened with a loud bang, and in walked the last person anyone expected to see, Shadow. The aging German shepherd trotted down the aisle, his nails clicking against the floor. His fur, once a sleek, dark coat, was now graying at the edges. He moved with purpose, each step deliberate. And then, as the room fell into stunned silence, the dog stopped at the defendant's table and sat down. In his mouth was a black duffel bag, the seams frayed and worn with age. The courtroom was frozen. Not a single soul dared to speak. Jack's heart pounded in his chest. He couldn't believe it. Shadow had found something important. The dog wasn't just here for sentimental reasons. He had brought something with him. Jack's breath hitched as he glanced at his attorney, who was as shocked as everyone else. The prosecutor's eyes narrowed with suspicion, her gaze locked on the dog and the mysterious bag he held. "What's this?" the judge, a man with a long, weathered face, asked in disbelief. "He's here to help," Jack's attorney said, his voice shaking. "Let him bring it forward." The bailiff approached cautiously, reaching out to take the bag from Shadow's jaws. The dog growled softly, but did not resist. It was as if he knew what needed to be done. Slowly, the bag was handed to the tech expert at the front of the room, who began unzipping it with shaking hands. The air was thick with anticipation. "Inside this bag," the tech expert began, "is something we didn't expect." The courtroom watched, breathless, as the expert carefully removed a bundle of papers and a small device. The papers were tattered, aged, but the device, it was a small flash drive, no larger than a fingernail, glinting under the harsh courtroom lights. The judge raised an eyebrow, but remained silent. This wasn't something anyone had prepared for. Jack's mind raced. Could this be it? Was this the moment everything would change? Shadow had always been more than just a partner to him. He had been a lifeline, his constant companion, his confidant in a world that didn't understand. And now, Shadow had brought him this. "What is it?" the prosecutor snapped, her patience thinning. What's on that drive? I don't know, Jack said, his voice hoarse. But I know that dog. He wouldn't have brought it if it didn't matter. The judge sighed, rubbing his temple. He motioned for the tech expert to examine the contents of the drive privately, the tension building as everyone waited. And then, as if the weight of the moment had finally settled into his bones, the judge turned to the prosecutor. "We'll take a short recess," he said. "This will take some time." As the gavel came down, signaling the break, Jack's mind wandered. This wasn't just a trial anymore. It was a battle. And it wasn't only for his life. It was for the life of the truth. His heart ached for the child who had died, for the family that still grieved. But he had to believe that Shadow's discovery was more than just a twist of fate. This was the moment that could save him. But what was on that drive? What secrets had been buried in the shadows? Before the doors closed behind him, Jack spoke to the room. "Subscribe to Heroes for Animals on YouTube," he said, his voice low but clear. "Because sometimes the real heroes aren't the ones you expect." And with that, the courtroom filled with whispers, but Jack's focus remained on one thing, the hope that, finally, the truth would come to light. The gavel struck again, signaling the short recess, and the room buzzed with nervous energy. Everyone, from the prosecutor to the defense attorney to the witnesses still seated in the gallery, seemed to have one question on their minds. What was on the flash drive? Jack could feel the weight of those gazes on him as he remained seated, the silence pressing down like a heavy fog. Shadow lay at his feet, head low, eyes watching everyone, his breathing steady but purposeful. Jack didn't dare look away. He couldn't. Not now. As the minutes ticked by, Jack's thoughts swirled like the storm outside. The whole town had turned against him. The whispers had started long before the trial, but now they were louder, and the weight of the accusations was suffocating. A former officer, a former hero, accused of murder. How had it come to this? All he had ever wanted was to do the right thing, to serve and protect. But now, he was sitting in a courtroom, fighting for his life. He glanced down at Shadow, who looked up at him with those wise eyes. The bond between them had always been something unspoken, a connection that went beyond words. It wasn't just about the work they had done together, rescuing lost children, sniffing out dangerous criminals, and fighting to protect those who couldn't protect themselves. It was deeper than that. Shadow had been there for Jack when no one else was, standing beside him through the dark times, offering comfort without asking for anything in return. Shadow had been his family when his own had turned their backs on him. Jack had always trusted him, and now he was hoping, praying, that trust would save him. "Your Honor, can we proceed?" The prosecutor's voice sliced through the silence, sharp as glass. She was a woman who had built her career on convictions. She wasn't used to waiting, especially not for something as unpredictable as a dog and a mysterious flash drive. The judge, a man whose experience had taught him to handle just about every type of case, rubbed his tired eyes. He was as old as the courthouse itself, a relic of a time when justice seemed clearer, when the truth was easier to grasp. Now, it seemed, the truth was slipping through his fingers like water. "Let's give it a few more minutes," he said, his voice hoarse. "I'm not making any decisions until we know exactly what's on that drive." As the recess dragged on, the tension in the room grew thick. Jack could feel his hands begin to tremble. The uncertainty gnawed at him. Would this flash drive be his salvation or his downfall? Could it really contain the evidence that could clear his name? Across the room, the prosecutor paced back and forth, her heels clicking against the tile. She was a woman who liked control. Her perfectly styled hair and expensive suit were a sharp contrast to the rough-around-the-edges townspeople who had gathered in the courtroom. She was used to power, to taking charge, to seeing things through her own lens. But she didn't understand the bond between Jack and Shadow. She didn't understand that the truth wasn't always something that could be measured or controlled by logic and evidence. "Do you really think this will change anything?" the prosecutor had asked Jack earlier in the trial, her voice dripping with disdain. "Do you honestly believe a dog will save you?" Jack had looked her dead in the eye. "It's not just the dog," he'd said. "It's the truth." Now, as the clock ticked away, the truth seemed closer than ever. The tech expert had already plugged the flash drive into a laptop, the screen flickering as it loaded. The room waited in silence, as if holding its collective breath. Finally, the expert stood up, adjusting his glasses as he turned to face the judge. "Your Honor, the contents of the flash drive are disturbing." Jack's heart skipped a beat. The judge leaned forward, eyes narrowing. "Disturbing how?" "There's a video, a recording from the night in question," the expert continued. "It's encrypted, but I was able to decrypt it. What it shows, well, it changes everything." The room held its breath. "Play it," the judge ordered, his voice firm, though his knuckles whitened as he gripped the edge of the table. With a few clicks, the video began to play. On the screen, Jack saw a night he had thought he would never have to revisit. The footage was grainy, shaky. It had been captured from a small camera attached to Shadow's collar, a device that Jack had forgotten even existed. He'd never intended for it to be used as evidence. Shadow's cam had always been a tool for their work in the field, not something meant for a courtroom drama like this. The video started with a view of the woods. The camera bounced with Shadow's movements as he and Jack approached the abandoned cabin. The sounds of their footsteps, the creaking of the trees, and the occasional growl of the canine partner filled the air. The video skipped ahead, showing Shadow entering the cabin. His senses heightened, ears perked for any sign of danger. Then the footage shifted. The camera panned to a figure standing in the doorway, a figure Jack recognized all too well. It was Officer Kent, the same officer who had been the first to accuse Jack of the crime. "Shadow, stay!" Jack's voice came through the footage, quiet but clear. The video continued, showing Kent in a heated conversation with another person, someone who had their face obscured. They were arguing about a deal, about how the evidence was supposed to be planted, how the whole thing was supposed to look like an accident. And then, a loud crash. A struggle. Gunshots. The screen went black for a few seconds, but when it returned, the camera was still rolling. Shadow was standing over a figure, growling softly as Jack's voice came through the speaker. "Shadow, get back!" Jack said in a firm voice. "We have to go. It's not safe." The figure was unconscious but alive. The video cut abruptly. The room was silent. Jack's heart raced as he processed what he had just seen. The person in the video wasn't dead. There had been a cover-up, a lie. Kent had been involved in something much darker, something that went far beyond a simple accusation. He had planted evidence, framed Jack for a crime he didn't commit. The truth was out there, and it was undeniable. As the room processed what had just been revealed, Jack stood up, his legs shaky. Shadow lifted his head, as if sensing his partner's rising determination. Jack turned to the judge. "Your Honor," he said, his voice steady despite the rush of adrenaline coursing through him, "I'm not guilty. I never was." The judge's gaze softened as he looked at Jack, then at Shadow, who was still sitting calmly by Jack's side. "I think we need to take another look at the evidence." In the midst of the trial, a quiet plea for justice had been made, and with Shadow's discovery, the truth was finally starting to break free from the shadows. Would the trial end in redemption, or would there still be those willing to fight to keep the truth buried? Jack wasn't sure, but one thing was clear. He wasn't giving up. Not now. Not ever. As the courtroom began to buzz again with whispered conversations, Jack allowed himself a quiet moment. He looked down at Shadow, the dog who had always been more than just a partner. They had been through hell together, but now, finally, they had the chance to set things right. And that, in the end, was all that mattered. The courthouse was more crowded now than it had been at the start of the trial. Word had gotten out about the flash drive, and with it, the revelation that Jack might not be the man everyone thought he was. The whispers continued to hum through the crowd as the trial resumed after the recess. Jack stood by his attorney, his mind a storm of thoughts. But through the chaos, one thing was certain. He had to get through today. He had to clear his name, not just for himself, but for the people who believed in him, for Shadow, and for the truth. It wasn't just about proving his innocence. It was about uncovering everything. The video had shown a glimpse of the dark conspiracy that had been brewing long before Jack had found himself on trial. The prosecutor had already started to piece the puzzle together, but there were still so many missing parts. Jack needed to know how deep this went. He needed to find out who else was involved, and who had been pulling the strings. The judge's gavel sounded, calling the room to order, and the tech expert returned to his seat with a solemn expression. He had already done his part. Now it was time for the next step. "We've reviewed the footage," the judge said, his voice deep with authority, though tinged with exhaustion. "We can confirm that this video provides a new perspective on the events surrounding the crime. The defense may proceed." Jack's attorney stood up, his hands trembling as he made his way to the podium. Jack watched him, feeling a mix of hope and fear. This was it. This was the moment that could either seal his fate or set him free. "Your Honor, members of the jury," the attorney began, his voice shaky but determined. "What you've seen here today is not just the desperate actions of a man trying to cover his tracks. It's proof that the real criminals are still walking free, hiding in plain sight." Jack could feel the weight of the room's eyes on him as his attorney continued to speak, but he couldn't focus on anything except the memory of that night. The night the world had shifted for him. The night that had begun the chain of events leading him to this courtroom. He could still hear the sounds in his mind. The crunch of dry leaves beneath Shadow's paws, the sharp tang of cold air in his lungs, the silence before the chaos erupted. It had started as just another mission, another search and rescue. But nothing in his years of service had prepared him for the truth he would find that night. 6 months ago, Jack had been tasked with a seemingly simple job. The search for a missing child had led him and Shadow deep into the woods on the outskirts of town. The child, a 6-year-old girl named Emma, had disappeared without a trace. Her parents were frantic, her face plastered on every billboard and news outlet. She was the type of missing person that triggered all the alarms, the type that pulled everyone in to search with urgency. But the deeper they went into the woods, the more Jack began to feel like something wasn't right. He remembered the tension in the air that night. Shadow had been on edge, his ears pricked, his movements stiff. The dog had always been intuitive, but tonight, something was different. It wasn't just the sense of danger in the air. It was something Jack couldn't quite put into words. They had followed the scent trail for hours, moving through the dense brush, until they came upon the abandoned cabin. It was in the clearing, hidden just enough to remain out of sight, but not far enough to escape notice. The wood of the cabin had rotted away in places, windows boarded up, and the door barely hanging on its hinges. It looked like no one had lived there for years. Jack had instinctively pulled back, but Shadow had refused to leave. The dog's growls had sent a shiver down Jack's spine, and before he knew it, he was moving toward the door. They weren't supposed to investigate alone, but in that moment, Jack had felt compelled to follow his partner's lead. Inside the cabin, everything was in disarray. Furniture overturned, shelves empty. The faint scent of mildew filled the air, but there was something else, something metallic, like blood. Jack had reached for his radio to call for backup, but before he could speak, Shadow had bolted forward, barking aggressively. "Stay," Jack had whispered, but Shadow had already charged, his paws clattering against the wooden floor. Jack had no choice but to follow, moving quickly to keep up with his partner. They entered a small room in the back, and that was when Jack had seen him. The officer. Officer Kent, standing near the far corner, a flash of something in his hand. Jack had frozen, recognizing Kent instantly. The man had been in charge of the search efforts. He had been the one to coordinate everything, to keep the pressure on the investigation. But something about his stance, the way he held himself, told Jack that Kent wasn't there to help. "Jack!" Kent had shouted, his voice tight, almost panicked. "What are you doing here?" Before Jack could respond, the argument had started. Kent had tried to deflect, to play it off, but Jack's instincts had kicked in. Something was off, and Shadow's growls were enough to confirm that Jack wasn't just imagining it. The confrontation had escalated quickly. Words turned into shoves, and then it was a struggle. Kent had pulled out a gun, but before he could aim, there had been a flash of light, the crack of gunfire, and then the world had spun. When Jack regained consciousness, the cabin was still. The gunfire was gone, but the figure in the corner wasn't moving. Kent had been knocked out cold. Jack had checked his pulse, relieved to find he was alive. But then, everything had gone wrong. A few minutes later, the officers arrived, and Jack had been forced to leave. Kent's injuries had been blamed on Jack's actions, but Jack knew better. He knew the truth. But the truth wasn't enough. The following weeks were filled with confusion, with conflicting reports, with questions that no one could answer. They'd found Emma's body days later, abandoned in the woods. The case had gone cold, but Jack had never let go of the feeling that something was off. Something had been wrong from the very beginning. Now, as the trial wore on, Jack's mind kept returning to that night. Kent had planted evidence, framed Jack, and worse yet, he'd been involved in the cover-up. And the video, the one that Shadow had found, was just the beginning. There were still more pieces to the puzzle, and Jack had no intention of backing down until he had them all. The truth was within his grasp. The courtroom had settled into an eerie quiet, the kind that made the air feel heavy and thick. Jack sat at the defendant's table, his hands clenched so tightly that his knuckles had turned white. Shadow lay at his feet, still and calm, but Jack could feel the tension radiating from him. The dog had always been able to sense when something wasn't right, and right now, everything felt wrong. As the judge called the proceedings to order, Jack tried to focus. His mind was racing, but he couldn't let the panic set in. Not now. Not when they were so close. He glanced across the room at the prosecutor, who was leaning back in her chair, a smug look on her face. She had been relentless from the beginning, building a case against Jack piece by piece, slowly dismantling his life in front of the jury. It didn't matter that the evidence was flimsy, that the key witness was a man with a history of questionable behavior. She had a story, and she was sticking to it. But now, there was something more, something that Jack hadn't expected. The flash drive, the video, the evidence that Shadow had brought to light, was only the beginning. It was a small piece of a much larger puzzle. Jack had hoped it would be enough, but he knew now that it wasn't. The truth was more complicated than he had ever imagined. The corruption ran deeper than he could have ever guessed. The prosecutor stood up, her heels clicking sharply against the floor as she made her way to the podium. She had already played her cards, presenting the video as damning evidence. She'd shown the jury the footage of Kent and his accomplice, but she hadn't shown them everything. She hadn't shown them the other video, the one Jack had seen in his nightmares, the one that made his stomach turn every time he thought about it, the one that showed a hidden room beneath the cabin. "Your Honor," the prosecutor began, her voice smooth, almost patronizing. "I think we've seen enough. The evidence is clear. Officer Rayner was responsible for the death of Emily Thompson. The defense has no case. It's time to end this." Jack's attorney, who had been sitting quietly at his side, suddenly sprang to his feet. "Objection!" he shouted, his voice sharp. "Your Honor, we still have more evidence to present. There's more to this story, and it's crucial that we show it to the jury." The judge's eyes narrowed. "More evidence? What are you talking about?" Jack's attorney motioned for the tech expert, who had been standing by the entire time, to step forward. The expert nodded and quickly approached the judge. "Your Honor, we've reviewed the additional footage from the flash drive, and it contains information that has yet to be revealed." Jack's heart pounded in his chest. He knew what was coming, but he wasn't sure if he was ready for it. The truth was about to come out, but the fallout could be devastating. The tech expert plugged the flash drive into the laptop again, and the screen flickered to life. The video began to play, but this time it wasn't the shaky footage from the cabin. It was a different perspective, one that Jack hadn't seen before. A second camera, hidden somewhere in the cabin, captured the scene from a different angle. In the video, Jack saw himself again, standing next to Kent. But this time, something was different. There was a figure in the background, a figure that hadn't been visible in the first video. The figure was a woman, and she was standing by a door in the back of the cabin, her face hidden in the shadows. Kent's voice came through the speakers again, but this time it wasn't just a simple conversation. He was speaking to someone in the room, someone Jack didn't recognize. The woman's voice was low and steady, almost mechanical, as if she had rehearsed her words. "We've done it. It's over," she said, her words dripping with satisfaction. "The evidence is planted. We'll make sure Rayner takes the fall. No one will ever know the truth." Jack's stomach churned. This was it. The moment he had been dreading. The moment when the full scope of the conspiracy was revealed. The woman's face finally came into view, and Jack's blood ran cold. It was Sarah Miller, the town's sheriff. The same woman who had been in charge of the investigation from the very beginning. The same woman who had assured everyone that she was doing everything in her power to find the truth. But there it was, clear as day. Sarah Miller had been a part of the cover-up from the start. "Sarah Miller?" the prosecutor asked, her voice a mix of shock and disbelief. "You're telling me the sheriff was involved in this?" Jack's attorney stepped forward, his voice calm but firm. "Yes, Your Honor. The sheriff, along with Officer Kent, had orchestrated the entire thing. They planted the evidence, framed Officer Rayner, and then tried to cover it up." The courtroom was in chaos. The prosecutor stood frozen, unable to respond. The jury was in shock, murmuring amongst themselves, trying to process the betrayal that had just been revealed. Even the judge seemed taken aback. He had known that the case was complicated. But this? This was beyond anything he had imagined. The room quieted down as the tech expert clicked a few buttons on the laptop, and another video began to play. This time, it was a recording from the sheriff's office, showing Sarah Miller in a meeting with several other officers, including Kent. "This is it," Sarah Miller's voice rang out in the video as she paced back and forth. "We take him down. Rayner's a loose cannon, and if we let him off the hook, it'll all fall apart. We've already covered our tracks. The evidence is solid. No one will question it." Jack's heart sank as he listened to her plan, to the cold, calculated way she spoke about him. He had trusted her. He had respected her as a colleague, as a fellow officer. But now he saw the truth. The sheriff had been the mastermind behind it all. As the video ended, the courtroom was silent. No one knew what to say. The weight of the revelation hung in the air like a thick fog. Jack felt his world shift beneath him. Everything he had believed about his career, about his colleagues, was a lie. The people he had trusted most had betrayed him in the worst possible way. But there was no turning back now. The truth had come out. "Your Honor," Jack's attorney said, his voice steady, "I request that all charges be dropped immediately. Officer Rayner was framed, and the real criminals are the ones who should be standing trial." The judge's face was grim as he looked at the evidence before him. It was undeniable. The sheriff, the officers, the entire system had been compromised. Jack wasn't the criminal here. He had been the victim of a corrupt conspiracy that reached to the highest levels of law enforcement. With a heavy sigh, the judge nodded. "I will review the evidence and make my ruling. For now, we are adjourned." As the gavel came down, Jack couldn't help but feel a sense of relief wash over him. The truth was finally coming to light. And while the road ahead was uncertain, he knew that he wasn't alone. Shadow had been there through it all, and together they had uncovered a web of deceit that would change the town forever. The judge's gavel echoed through the courtroom, signaling the start of the final moments in a trial that had already turned the town upside down. Jack's heart raced, a storm of conflicting emotions swirling inside him. For months he had been living under the shadow of a crime he didn't commit. But now, with the truth spilling out in front of everyone, he had the chance to finally be free. Yet something still gnawed at him, something deeper than the legal battle that was unfolding. The room was still buzzing with the aftermath of the shocking revelation. The sheriff's involvement in the conspiracy, the planted evidence, and the false charges that had nearly ruined Jack's life. The prosecutor, normally confident and composed, was visibly rattled. She had spent so much time building a case against Jack that it seemed impossible for her to grasp that everything she had worked for was now crumbling at her feet. And the jury? They were still trying to digest the magnitude of the lies that had been fed to them for so long. Jack's attorney, though visibly relieved by the progress, didn't let his guard down. He knew this was just the beginning. The truth might have come to light, but there were still too many questions left unanswered. Too many people still at risk of escaping justice. "Your Honor," the defense attorney began, his voice steady but filled with a quiet intensity, "we request that all charges against Officer Rayner be dismissed, effective immediately. What we've seen here today proves beyond a shadow of a doubt that he was framed. And the true criminals, the ones who plotted this entire cover-up, are still out there." The prosecutor stood up, her face pale, her hands trembling slightly. She knew she had lost, but she wasn't ready to admit defeat. "Your Honor," she said, her voice tight with anger, "this is an outrageous request. We've only just begun to scratch the surface of this investigation. If you dismiss the charges now, you are letting a murderer go free. A killer who has already taken the life of an innocent child." Jack clenched his jaw, anger rising within him. The prosecutor was grasping at straws, trying to hold on to the case she had already lost. He knew the truth was on his side, but that didn't make the sting of her words any less painful. Emily's death had been tragic. She didn't deserve to die, and neither did the other children who had suffered because of the web of lies that had been spun around Jack. The judge, however, didn't waver. He had seen enough. "I've heard enough," he said, his voice commanding. "This trial is adjourned for the day. I will review the evidence and make my ruling tomorrow." As the court session came to an end, Jack stood up and glanced down at Shadow, who had remained by his side throughout the entire trial. The dog's steady presence had been a lifeline for Jack. something solid to hold on to when the world seemed to be falling apart. But now, as the courtroom emptied out and the echoes of the gavel faded into the background, Jack's thoughts returned to that night, the night everything had changed. He hadn't been prepared for the darkness that had consumed the investigation. It wasn't just the corruption that had plagued the department. It was the betrayal that had come from people he had trusted, people who had worked alongside him. And it was the fact that Jack had always believed in the system, in the idea of justice, even when things seemed impossible. But now, everything was shattered. His faith in the people he had once called colleagues in the justice system was gone. The streets outside of the courthouse were bustling, filled with people talking in hushed voices, their expressions a mix of curiosity and disbelief. Jack's attorney had been quick to leave, knowing that there was little left to be done until the judge issued his ruling. But Jack couldn't bring himself to leave yet. He needed a moment, a breath of air before facing what was coming next. "I'll be right back," Jack said to Shadow, giving the dog a soft pat on the head. He needed to clear his mind. He needed to think. As he stepped out of the courthouse, Jack was hit by the cool night air. The streets were still wet from the afternoon rain, and the sky overhead was heavy with clouds, casting an almost oppressive darkness over the town. He walked down the street, his footsteps slow, deliberate, as he tried to process everything that had happened. He had always thought he knew what was right. He had always believed in the power of good, of truth, of justice. But now, after everything that had unfolded, he wasn't sure what to believe anymore. How had it all gone so wrong? How had he been dragged into a web of lies so carefully constructed that even he couldn't see it until it was almost too late? Jack's mind drifted back to that night, the night he and Shadow had discovered the truth about the missing children. It hadn't been just about one girl's death. It was about a system that had failed to protect the innocent. It was about a network of people who had used their power to cover up their crimes, to manipulate the system for their own gain. And it was about the people who had been silenced, people whose voices had been drowned out by the weight of corruption. And now, the truth was coming to light. But Jack couldn't help but feel that it was too late. Too many lives had been destroyed in the process, and as much as he wanted to walk away from all of it, he knew he couldn't. Not while there were still people out there who needed to be held accountable. "Jack!" The voice pulled him from his thoughts, and he turned to see his attorney standing at the corner of the street. The man was looking at him with a mix of concern and caution. "Are you okay?" the attorney asked. "You've been through a lot. This isn't over yet." Jack took a deep breath. He could feel the weight of the world on his shoulders, but for the first time in a long time, he didn't feel completely alone. Shadow was there, still by his side, as steadfast as ever. And Jack was determined to see this through. "I'm fine," Jack said, though the words felt hollow. I need to know the truth. All of it." The attorney nodded, understanding. "We'll get there. We just need to be patient." But patience was something Jack had run out of. He wasn't sure how much longer he could wait. The trial was nearing its end, but the war for the truth wasn't over yet. The courtroom felt colder now, despite the heat of the late afternoon sun seeping through the tall windows. It had been weeks since the trial began, and today was supposed to be the day everything would be decided. Jack stood at the defense table, his heart pounding as the final moments of the trial stretched out before him. Shadow, as always, lay by his side, his body relaxed, but his eyes alert, sensing his partner's nerves. Jack knew it was almost over, one way or another. As the room settled, the judge walked in, his robes sweeping the floor as he took his seat. He didn't waste time. The weight of the case was evident on his face, but he had seen enough. The entire trial had felt like a battle, one Jack hadn't been prepared for. He had thought he could handle the pressure. handle the accusations. But standing there, at the center of it all, he realized just how much it had taken out of him. Not just his career, not just his reputation, but his faith in the system, in everything he had ever believed about justice. The judge's voice broke through Jack's thoughts, cold and impartial. After reviewing all the evidence and considering the testimonies presented, this court has reached a decision. Jack's attorney stood next to him, his face serious but determined. The prosecutor, on the other hand, seemed to be bracing herself, her fingers gripping the edge of the table in front of her, her knuckles white. She had pushed so hard for a conviction, only to find herself facing the undeniable truth that had come to light over the past weeks. Her gaze met Jack's briefly, but there was no sympathy in her eyes, only the ghost of her lost battle. The charges against Officer Jack Rayner, the judge continued, are hereby dismissed. A collective gasp filled the room. It wasn't just Jack's relief that hung in the air. It was the realization that a corrupt system had been exposed, and for once, justice had triumphed. The lies, the deceit, the cover-up, they had all come crashing down, and Jack had been vindicated. But the victory was bittersweet. Jack felt a heavy weight settle over him, even as the courtroom erupted in whispers and murmurs. He had won, but at what cost? The damage had already been done. Lives had been shattered. His own. The victims of the conspiracy. The families that had trusted the very people who had betrayed them. The scars wouldn't disappear just because the court had declared him innocent. Jack stood there, frozen for a moment, before he finally exhaled, letting the tension flood out of his body. Shadow, sensing his release of tension, nudged Jack's leg with his nose. Jack smiled down at the dog, his loyal partner, who had been there through everything, never wavering, always by his side. "Good boy," Jack whispered, his voice hoarse. Shadow's tail thumped once, a quiet but reassuring gesture. They were in this together, and now, finally, they could begin to move forward. The judge's gavel came down with a firm thud, signaling the end of the proceedings. "This court is adjourned," the judge declared, and just like that, the trial that had consumed their lives was over. Jack's attorney stepped forward, extending his hand. "You did it, Jack," he said, his voice filled with relief. "We did it." Jack shook the man's hand, but his mind was already drifting, the weight of the entire ordeal still pressing on him. He had been exonerated, but that didn't change the fact that it had all happened. The conspiracy, the lies, the betrayal, it had all been real. And in the end, the truth had cost more than just his career. It had cost him his trust in the very people he had spent his life protecting. As Jack made his way out of the courtroom, Shadow at his side, he felt the eyes of the onlookers following him. Some were sympathetic, others curious, but Jack didn't care. He wasn't walking out as a hero. He was walking out as a man who had survived the darkest part of his life and had come out the other side, battered but alive. The street outside was quieter than Jack had expected. The sun was dipping below the horizon, casting long shadows across the pavement. The weight of the day finally caught up with him as he stepped into the cool evening air. He paused for a moment, taking in the stillness, the sense of finality. The trial had taken everything from him, but it had also given him something he hadn't expected, the chance to start over. Shadow walked beside him, as always, never faltering, never questioning, just being there. Jack looked down at the dog, his faithful companion, and whispered, "Let's go home." They walked in silence, the sounds of the town fading behind them. Jack wasn't sure what the future held, but for the first time in months, he felt a spark of hope. Maybe there was something beyond this. Maybe there was a life after all the pain. The world was wide open, and while the past would always be with him, it no longer had to define him. As Jack reached his car, he paused and turned to Shadow. "You're the real hero, aren't you?" Jack chuckled softly, shaking his head. Shadow wagged his tail, as if in agreement. Jack opened the car door and climbed in. The familiar sound of the engine starting, bringing a sense of normalcy back to his life. It wasn't much, but it was something. As they drove off into the night, Jack knew that this was just the beginning of a new chapter. The pain would fade, the scars would heal, and life would go on. Thank you for staying with us throughout this story. We've seen the journey of Officer Jack Rayner and his canine partner Shadow as they fought for truth and justice, exposing a web of corruption that ran deeper than anyone could have imagined. This tale was about more than just clearing a name. It was about the strength to overcome betrayal, the courage to stand tall when everything seems lost, and the bond between man and dog that can never be broken. Now, I want to hear from you. Have you ever faced a situation where you had to fight for what was right, even when the odds were stacked against you? How did you find the strength to carry on? Let us know in the comments below. And as always, don't forget to subscribe to Heroes for Animals for more incredible stories like this.